There are those in history whose names shine with the dignified sheen of marble statues: Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, the sort who hover, perpetually bathed in the flattering light of school syllabuses and bronze commemorations. But then there are others, the ones who exist on the margins of footnotes, whose lives were no less interesting, no less instructive, and perhaps, if we're being perfectly honest, far more fun. Bion of Borysthenes belongs to this latter category. He is not a household name. He is not even really a philosopher in the way we've come to understand the term. He was a performer, a jester with a sting, a Socrates with sarcasm, a street corner satirist of the highest order. Bion didn't write treatises, found a school, or compose solemn meditations. He mocked, he laughed, he prodded the pompous, and exposed the absurd. He was, in short, rather marvelous. But before he became the philosophical equivalent of a stand-up comic with a torch of truth, before he sharpened his wit on the stony faces of self-important sages, Bion began life in less than ideal conditions. Far less, in fact. He was born, sometime in the 4th century BCE, in the Greek colony of Olbia, nestled rather out of the way near the mouth of the Dnipro River, on the northern coast of the Black Sea. A cultural outpost, if you like, a place where Hellenic civilization mingled with Scythian barbarism, and where the Greek tongue was spoken with, one imagines, a somewhat soggy accent. His father, and here comes the first twist in the tale, was a freedman, a former slave, who had earned or been granted his liberty. He set himself up in business, selling pickled fish and, somewhat less appetizingly, human beings. Yes, Bion's father was a slave trader, a man who trafficked in lives while raising a family of his own. If you're looking for irony, you're in luck. Bion's life is full of it. But irony, like the gods, does not stop at the first sign of poetic justice. At some point, the father and the entire household fell into debt or disrepute or both. The specifics are lost in the mists of antiquity, but the result is deliciously grim. The slave trader's own family was sold into slavery, and thus young Bion, born free, became a slave, not metaphorically, not allegorically, but factually, materially, and humiliatingly. One imagines the scene: the son of a man who once haggled over the price of others, now standing on a block himself, subjected to the same leering appraisals and callous hands. History may not always rhyme, but it does love a good punchline. But here, the narrative swerves once again. Bion was bought by a rhetorician, one of those ancient Greek public intellectuals who were equal parts lawyer, professor, and orator. It was rather like being purchased by a TED Talk, and whether out of curiosity, pity, or shrewdness, this man didn't send Bion off to dig ditches or polish sandals. He educated him. He taught him how to speak, how to argue, how to think. And Bion, clever little sponge that he was, soaked it all up. When his master died, and again, the details are smudged with the passage of time, Bion found himself free. Either he was formally manumitted, or he inherited his master's estate. However it happened, the slave became, once more, a free man. But this time, he was armed with more than a name. He had words, and with them, power. What does a man do, newly freed, freshly educated, and still burning with the bitterness of humiliation and injustice? In Bion's case, he walked, or possibly strutted, to Athens, that bustling agora of intellect and ego, and he began studying philosophy. Not just one school, mind you, but all of them. The Academy of Plato, the Lyceum of Aristotle, the Garden of Epicurus, the Porch of the Stoics, even the snarling kennel of the cynics. Bion toured them all like a curious, critical tourist. And it was the cynics, above all, who captured him. Their scorn for convention, their love of truth stripped bare, their glorious disdain for wealth, power, and puffed-up propriety, it sang to something in him. Here was a philosophy that did not merely ponder life, but poked it in the ribs and asked it why it was being such a pompous bore. From the ashes of his servitude, Bion emerged as a philosophical provocateur, wielding wit like a dagger and laughter like a lantern. He was said to mimic, to mock, to moralize with a twinkle in his eye and vinegar on his tongue. He turned lectures into performances, truths into barbs, and ideas into jests that still echo across centuries. But before the sharp tongue, before the performative flair, before the bold irreverence that made even the Stoics raise an eyebrow, there was the boy. A boy born into precarious freedom, dragged through the grim machinery of slavery and spat out on the other side. Not broken, but sharpened. Bion of Borysthenes didn't begin his life as a philosopher. He began it as property. But he would become a thinker who owned every room he entered, not by wealth, nor by rank, but by the power of saying the most uncomfortable thing in the most delightful way. And in that, perhaps, he was freer than all the rest. Now that our hero, though he'd probably have scoffed at the word, had been freed from the shackles of literal slavery, he turned his attention to an even more curious bondage, the chains of human folly. Bion, now equipped with a mind honed by hardship and sharpened by rhetoric, strode into the world of Greek philosophy like a man walking into a party he wasn't invited to, and immediately began rearranging the furniture. Athens, of course, was the intellectual catwalk of the ancient world. If you had an idea and a beard, you could probably find a few followers and start a school. And Bion, ever the intellectual omnivore, sampled them all. He tried Plato's academy, where souls were sorted like wine vintages, and reality was a series of shadows on a cave wall. All very noble, very abstract, but Bion seems to have found it all a touch too cloudy for his taste. Philosophy, he felt, should be about people, not planets. He wanted something more immediate, more urgent, less humming in temples, and more barking in marketplaces. Then came the Aristotelians, with their delightfully obsessive categorizing of absolutely everything: ethics, biology, drama, weather, eyebrow shapes, you name it. Aristotle had an opinion on it. But this too didn't quite scratch Bion's itch. There was too much measuring and not enough laughing. Next, he flirted with the Stoics, those stern-faced moralists who believed virtue was the only good and that passion was something to be wrung out like a wet tunic. Bion, never one to miss a punchline, described the Stoics as men who thought emotions were beneath them, until they stubbed a toe or stepped in dog muck. And the Epicureans? Ah, yes. Delightful lot, really. Champions of moderate pleasure, the well-arranged life, and avoiding both pain and politics. Bion appreciated their serenity, but not their seclusion. He didn't want to retreat into a garden with figs and like-minded friends. He wanted to wade into the crowd, poke the powerful, and see what rattled. But it was the cynics who truly struck a chord. Not that he became one, properly speaking. Bion was far too slippery for labels. Still, the cynics, with their unwashed tunics, their relentless mockery of social norms, their divine disregard for wealth and status, offered a kind of performance art that Bion found irresistible. You see, the cynics weren't so much a school of thought as a roaming band of philosophical pranksters. Diogenes, the movement's poster child, once lived in a barrel and told Alexander the Great to step out of his sunlight. This was philosophy not as lecture, but as provocation. It dared the world to take itself less seriously. Bion adored this, but he added his own twist. While the original cynics grunted and gestured like street prophets, Bion spoke, eloquently, sardonically, musically. He was, in effect, the world's first stand-up philosopher. He didn't merely sneer at human foolishness, he sang it, with rhythm and rhetoric. He was known to break into verse, to impersonate other philosophers, to deliver moral lessons dressed up as comic monologues. And his targets? Everyone. Hypocrites, social climbers, religious charlatans, pompous intellectuals, cowardly politicians, none were spared. He was the gadfly's gadfly, the Socratic mosquito dipped in honey and acid. There's a story, and Greek biography is always more myth than manuscript, that he once stood in the agora, pointing at a wealthy man and saying, "There goes a walking stomach, well-fed but empty-headed." Another time, asked what kind of music best suited a philosopher, he replied, "None, unless it drowns out his own nonsense." Bion's favorite weapon was parody. He would take solemn sayings from revered philosophers and twist them into mockeries. Where others offered gravitas, he offered irreverence. He believed philosophy had grown too pompous, too wrapped in its own tunics. He wanted to drag it back to the ground, or better yet, into the mud, where it could roll around with humanity and get properly dirty. But his scorn was never cruel. Not really. Beneath the mockery was a strange tenderness. He ridiculed because he cared. He mocked our vanity not to humiliate us, but to cure us of it. His laughter had purpose. He believed the first step to wisdom was not silence or solitude, but the capacity to laugh, especially at oneself. And perhaps, above all, he hated pretense. He had seen the ugliest side of life, and it gave him a nose for the phony. In a world where slaves could wear perfume and emperors could be cowards, Bion insisted on stripping things down. "Tell the truth," he might have said, "but say it with flair." In the end, what Bion practiced was a kind of joyful cynicism, a love of life spiced with satire. He didn't want to escape the world. He wanted to live in it fully, honestly, and with his eyes wide open, even if it meant being the only man laughing in a room full of solemn faces. And in doing so, he transformed philosophy from a static discipline into something almost theatrical, something alive, electric, and most shockingly of all, fun. If you had wandered through the Athenian agora in the early 3rd century BCE, dodging philosophers like pigeons and peddlers, you might have stumbled upon a curious scene. A man, quite respectably dressed by cynic standards, that is to say, not entirely naked, standing on a stone platform, entertaining a crowd, not with music or myth, but with mockery. Not of the gods, though he certainly didn't spare them, nor of the common man, whom he rather liked, but of the grand parade of philosophers who came before him. This was Bion of Borysthenes, part stand-up, part sophist, part Socratic scalpel, who believed truth, like wine, was best served undiluted and a little bit rude. And while his early days had been marked by trauma and slavery, and his middle years by philosophical playfulness, his later life added yet another layer: mortality. Bion did not flinch from the fact that we are all headed inexorably toward that final appointment none of us can cancel. On the contrary, he leaned in, laughed, and made it a theme. Unlike many thinkers who attempted to tiptoe past death as if it might not notice them, Bion squarely acknowledged it, and in typical style, made it a punchline. When asked how one should face death, he is reported to have said, "The same way one faces a boar, with patience and no sudden movements." He was, above all, a man who saw that death gives flavor to life. Remove it, and what are we? A tedious eternity of chit-chat and compost. It is death, Bion thought, that sharpens our questions. Why pursue virtue, if not to make life more bearable while it lasts? Why strip away pretense, unless we suspect there's not much time left to get to the good bits? Whereas the Stoics prepared for death like soldiers for battle, firm jaw, steady eye, inner calm, Bion did so like a jester. He offered laughter as armor and a raised eyebrow as sword. His jibes about the afterlife, for instance, would make even Epicurus blush. If there is a Tartarus, he once said, I suspect it's full of old philosophers lecturing each other on how they knew it all along. He saved particular contempt for professional mourners, those paid to weep and wail at funerals. If grief can be bought, he quipped, perhaps virtue can too, but I doubt either comes cheap. And temples, oh, the temples, he saw as little more than sanctuaries for the anxious and superstitious. The gods, he said, must tire of hearing the same prayers from men who've learned nothing. But for all his irreverence, there was in Bion a persistent moral undercurrent. He wasn't merely mocking death to provoke or amuse, he was using it as a mirror. Mortality, in his view, was the great clarifier. It exposed the absurdity of chasing fame, of hoarding wealth, of posturing with platitudes while time slips quietly out the door. If philosophy is the art of learning how to die, a notion the ancients adored, then Bion's school was less a seminar and more a one-man show with biting reviews and no tuition fee. His message, if one dares to boil him down, was rather simple. Life is short, people are silly, and if you can't laugh at both, you're doing it wrong. And it was not just death he confronted, but also illness, aging, and the slow humiliation of the body. Later in life, Bion suffered from some sort of wasting disease, perhaps tuberculosis, perhaps something worse, depending on which half-baked ancient biographer you believe. But even as his body failed him, his wit remained intact. When told he should pray for recovery, he allegedly replied, if the gods cared for health, they'd have given us thicker skin and fewer doctors. And when a pious friend suggested he offer a sacrifice, Bion responded, very well, I shall sacrifice my patience. To some, these were the ravings of a blasphemous cynic. To others, the words of a fearless sage. But to Bion, it was simply honesty, delivered with a grin and a shrug. There's something magnificent about a man who treats death not with dread nor with denial, but with derision, who looks at life, short, chaotic, tragic, absurd, and chooses not only to endure it, but to find it funny. In this, Bion is not merely a historical curiosity. He is, dare one say, an example, not of how to live in comfort, or prestige, or piety, but how to live awake. Awake to hypocrisy, awake to mortality, awake to the sheer ridiculousness of it all, and if possible, laughing. If there is one topic guaranteed to stir a philosopher's passions, ignite a poet's imagination, and utterly enrage a tax collector, it is religion. The divine, the sacred, the mysterious realm of gods, portents, rituals, and blinding certainties. What fun! And if anyone could bring an irreverent twinkle to this oh-so-serious subject, it was our old friend Bion of Borysthenes. You see, Bion was deeply suspicious of anything that couldn't be prodded, poked, or parodied, and few things in his day were more swollen with solemnity than the business of the gods. Temples, omens, oracles, goat entrails, thunderclaps interpreted as divine punctuation marks. It was all a bit much for a man who believed that truth should walk about barefoot and tell dirty jokes. Now, lest we mistake him for some crude anti-theist, Let us be clear. Bion was not hostile to the idea of divinity. He was simply unimpressed by the way humans had chosen to package and profit from it. He once said, "There are two kinds of gods, those made by the universe and those made by men. One inspires awe, the other collects donations." His barbs, unsurprisingly, were often aimed not at gods themselves, but at priests, prophets, and anyone else who claimed to speak on behalf of the divine while enjoying suspiciously earthly benefits. Bion saw the priesthood as theatre, though poorly acted, and religious ritual as little more than social choreography, where sincerity was optional and incense mandatory. Take oracles, for example. Those breathless utterances of doom and destiny issued from caves and sanctuaries, usually with the aid of a drugged-up priestess and a helpful interpreter. Bion, when asked what he thought of their wisdom, replied, "The only thing more ambiguous than an oracle is a politician promising reform. And sacrifices? Oh, he had a field day with those. The notion that one could curry divine favor by burning the thigh of a goat struck him as ludicrous. If the gods enjoy the smell, he said, why not roast onions and spare the livestock? He reserved special ridicule for the wealthy, who imagined that by lavishing gold upon temples they could bribe their way into Olympus. He gives to the gods, Bion quipped, but not to the beggar outside the temple. One cannot hear prayers over the sound of coin. But his criticisms weren't merely rhetorical flourishes. Underneath the wit was a serious conviction that religion, as practiced, had become a means of manipulation. It consoled the poor without empowering them, flattered the rich without challenging them, and declared virtue a divine mystery while selling answers for a fee. In this way, Bion was remarkably modern. He understood, long before it became fashionable, that religious institutions often served as instruments of control. They sanctified power, soothed the conscience of the exploiter, and preached endurance to the exploited. And yet, curiously, Bion did not fall into cold-hearted nihilism. He wasn't interested in tearing down the temple so much as opening the windows. Let in some air, he seemed to say. Ask better questions. Laugh loudly when told not to. Indeed, there was a kind of moral clarity to his skepticism. Bion believed that a god worthy of the name would not care for pomp or ceremony, but for justice, courage, decency, those very human things that require no altar to be practiced. When asked where the gods truly dwelt, Bion said, "In the acts we perform when no one is watching, not the prayers we recite when everyone is." His irreverence, then, was not mere cheek. It was ethical. It was born of a deep impatience with hypocrisy, especially when cloaked in holiness. He had seen too much of the world, its cruelties, its vanities, its comforting lies, to genuflect before robes and relics. He wanted a world less obsessed with appeasing imaginary deities and more concerned with treating real humans properly. And he was merciless toward those who claimed a monopoly on virtue while behaving monstrously. There are men, he said, who fast all day, prostrate themselves at dawn, and steal bread by dusk. But what made Bion unique, what elevates him above the mere skeptic or satirist, is that he never abandoned joy. He laughed not because he despised life, but because he adored it too much to see it twisted. He believed the truth deserved not only to be spoken, but to be enjoyed. And if that meant putting a philosopher in a dunce's cap or a prophet in a pie chart, so be it. In a time when gods were everywhere, behind every rock, inside every cough, weighing every coin, Bion stood up, grinned, and said, "Show me a god who makes men kinder, and I will believe. Until then, I shall believe in kindness." And that, I dare say, is not such a bad creed. It is an awkward business. The end of a philosopher. Poets die beautifully, painters tragically, generals dramatically. But philosophers, they tend to drift off rather than explode. Perhaps it's because they've spent so much time considering the nature of death, they forget to notice their own. Not so with Bion of Borysthenes. Ah, Bion. Even as he neared death, he was sharpening his tongue. Not for him the quiet deathbed whisper, the tearful last rites, the dramatic pronouncement of eternal truths. No, Bion's parting gift to the world was exactly what it had always been, a joke, a jab, and a truth so bare it made the pious wince. He knew he was dying. The sources, those marvelously unreliable, occasionally fanciful ancient biographers, tell us that Bion, riddled with disease, fading in body, but not in spirit, refused to play the part of the noble, suffering sage. He did not take up a solemn expression and wait to be turned into a statue. Instead, he made his death, like his life, a performance. When visitors came to comfort him with talk of the afterlife, he scoffed, "I shall report back if I find the office still open." When someone reminded him that even Socrates had gone to his death with dignity and calm, Bion replied, "Yes, well, Socrates wasn't dying of this." And when asked whether he feared punishment in Hades, he smiled and said, "If the dead are punished for their impiety, the judges will be too busy with priests to bother with me." But beneath the wit, and there was always something beneath the wit, there was reflection. Bion had lived through poverty, enslavement, and exile. He had watched the world at its worst and responded not with despair, but with laughter. He had mocked the hypocrite, not to destroy him, but to peel away the paint and reveal the man. He had laughed at the gods, not to banish them, but to stop us cowering before their poorly drawn portraits. And when death came, he did not curse it. He had, after all, spent a lifetime reminding others that it was coming. "You have a feast," he once said, "but you refuse to eat because the table will be cleared. Eat, you fool, the clearing is half the fun." He had no doctrine to leave behind, no school bearing his name, no dogmas carved into marble. His teachings, such as they were, existed in fragments, scattered lines, remembered insults, a few choice anecdotes passed down through the centuries, like particularly spicy gossip. But his influence, now that's another matter entirely. For Bion left behind something far more interesting than dogma. He left behind a tone, a style, a way of being in the world that said, it is possible to be wise and witty, to be honest without being cruel, to confront darkness with laughter and call it philosophy. He changed the very texture of moral thought, not with a grand theory, but with a shrug, a joke, a raised eyebrow. And while other thinkers were busy building systems like palaces, Bion was scribbling graffiti on their gates. "Remember to laugh, fools." He was perhaps the first truly modern moralist, suspicious of authority, allergic to pomp, humane in the extreme, and determined to get to the truth not by ascending into the clouds, but by walking among the people and noticing what made them ridiculous. And in that, there's something deeply, delightfully noble. Not noble in the Greek, muscle-straining, toga-wearing, virtue-posturing sense, but noble in the quiet way that matters, brave enough to mock, kind enough to care, and clever enough to see that a well-timed joke can save more souls than a sermon. So Bion of Borysthenes died as he lived, unafraid, unbending, and probably making someone very uncomfortable. No schools, no tomb of grandeur, no temple, just a voice, irreverent, probing, delightful, echoing faintly across the centuries. A reminder that philosophy, at its best, isn't a lecture. It's a laugh, followed perhaps by a pause, and then a thought you can't quite shake. And that, dear listener, is Bion.